Welcome to Rising Up for Justice, a special weekly series presented by Rising Up with Sonali, an independently produced, subscriber-supported program syndicated to radio stations, FreeSpeechTV, and podcast platforms. I'm SonaliKolhatkar, host and executive producer. Our nation and our world are overrun by billionaires and bigots, but they are few and we are many. On this series, exclusive to subscribers of Rising Up with Sonali and viewers of Free Speech TV, we'll hear from organizers and changemakers in the movements for social justice, and we'll dig into the nuts and bolts of values, strategies, tactics, narratives, and building power. This week on Rising Up for Justice, I'm joined by NickTilsen, the founder and CEO of NDN Collective. Nick is a citizen of the Oglala Lakota Nation. He has more than 20 years' experience in movement building, organizing, and equitable community development. Welcome to the program, Nick.
Hey, Sonali, thanks for having me on.
So NDN Collective has been around for a little while. What is the organization's main goal? And it's the letters NDN, for our radio audience. How do you, explain what the organization is, its main focus?
Yeah, so NDN Collective, NDN is slang for Indian. It's what we've called ourselves, and sort of reclaiming that term. We've been around. We're in our 8th year of existence now. In our 8th year, we just finished our 7th year. Indian Collective is dedicated to building Indigenous power and supporting the self-determination of Indigenous people that are doing the work of defending, developing, and decolonizing. And how we define that is like defending air, land, water, rights, community, developing regenerative and inclusive economies based on our values, decolonizing through the revitalization of Indigenous languages, ceremonies, lifeways. And Indian Collective is a movement infrastructure, that organization that supports Indigenous people throughout Turtle Island who are doing that work. And we have been a backbone organization of the Land Back movement, which is a movement dedicated to the returning of stolen Indigenous lands back into Indigenous hands. And so we do that through capacity building, grant making, lending, organizing, training, and building a more cohesive movement. And we really feel strongly that as Indigenous people continue to be supported and resourced, it actually creates the potential and opportunity for us to be in solidarity with other movements in stronger and bigger ways too.
And I'll definitely be asking about who those other institutions are that you're in solidarity with. But what was the impetus around forming it 8 years ago? Was there a particular historical development? How did the stars align, if you will, to and who were the people involved in starting this? You were one of the founders, so you would know the story, I imagine, quite well. What sparked it?
Yeah, actually, it was, Indian Collective grew out of work happening on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, where I'm from, in the Porcupine District, and place-based work happening there. At the time, I was running an organization called Thunder Valley Community Development, and we were doing regenerative community just transition work, and we were building a community from scratch at that time. And it was, we were doing food systems work, we were doing regenerative housing, we were doing Lakota language revitalization work, community development work. And the story of us being engaged as a community doing cultural organizing work that was resulting in these things, that story began to be lifted up. And many other Indigenous nations, in fact, over about 73 different Indigenous nations, over about a 3 to 4 year period, reached out to us, wanting to do something similar to what we were doing at Thunder Valley, but in the context of their climate, culture, and spirit of place. And we really didn't have the capacity. We were so busy in doing the work that we were doing on Pine Ridge that we didn't have the capacity to help other folks in that journey. But we invited folks, hey, if you come here, we'll share with you. And lo and behold, over about 30 of those different communities, maybe 35 of those different communities came came to Pine Ridge and learned about the Sustainable Regenerative Community Development Project and work that we were doing on Pine Ridge, and we were an open book. At that time, too, as that started to happen, a few years later, we got into 2016, and the beginning organizing started happening with the resistance against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And in the community that we were building, our water source for the Regenerative Community Development Project at Thunder Valley on Pine Ridge actually came via a rural water pipeline project, one of the largest water pipeline projects in North America, stretching from the Missouri River all the way to Pine Ridge. And so that's when, and then relatives in Standing Rock started reaching out to us in an effort to say, hey, we need your support. You know, we were a pretty successful organization. And so we pivoted and said, hey, we're doing sustainable community development and just transition work on Pine Ridge. It's really important that we engage in support. And so then we pivoted in supporting a lot of the infrastructure building at Standing Rock. And the impetus was that after Standing Rock happened, I watched as the environmental movement and the climate movement, descended on the Oshatishakowi and bring resources there, but then also watched when everybody left and the lack of infrastructure that was left for Indigenous people. And so I was at this crossroads of like building and working with so many different Indigenous nations who were trying to build, long-term systemic solutions in their communities, while at the same time we also needed movement infrastructure to be able to sustain change over time. And so that's how Indian Collective was birthed out of those things together. It wasn't just because of Standing Rock. It was a huge foundation that was laid for the years building up to Standing Rock and needs that were being called upon us throughout Indian country to do just transition work founded in Indigenous values.
I really appreciate that story, because that really helps ground the work for those of us who maybe have been paying some attention to Indian Collective's work. How do you achieve the goals of land back, right, which you said is one of your main issues, and one that you've taken a leadership on nationally? There's been media coverage of it. How does that work in terms of, is it just a matter of getting the resources together, finding the right land and the right buyers, and then buying it? I imagine it's a lot more complex than that.
Oh, it's really complex. I mean, our model is based on self-determination. So NDN doesn't, like, we're not going around looking for land per se. Um, our job as a movement organization is to support Indigenous people that are in the effort of doing that work. And um, and so what happens is Indigenous people from those communities who are working in their communities find a piece of land that is of significance to them. It could be a sacred site. It could be a place that is of significance for the ecology of the territory, historical significance. It runs the gamut. And those communities end up prioritizing. And so NDN Collective responds to requests that come to us from communities who are organizing and trying to achieve goals of land back. And we respond to that by supporting in the form of capacity building, helping develop strategy, using different financing mechanisms, funding models. Sometimes it's connecting them to different funders and connecting them to different resources. But I would say that almost every type of land back situation is unique. And I think that we have to lean into the complexity. But because we've done so much, not just about building the narrative around land back, but actually implementing, actually working with both tribes and organizations and collectives and communities to do the work of actually returning land, and then also what happens to the land after, that we've learned a lot in that process. And so we support Indigenous folks that are in the effort of doing that in multiple different ways. And so Yeah, sometimes it's a loan, sometimes it's a grant, sometimes it's conservation easements. There's all kinds of complexities
Right.
you can imagine.
Right. And what are some success stories briefly, if you can just share with us some examples of when it's worked, maybe it's been under Indigenous stewardship for a while and is thriving, compared to what it was before. Any sense you can give us of the concrete ways in which land back has really helped build Indigenous power?
Yeah, I mean, there's both small and big examples. Right. Some of the examples I like to use, like right in the Gesapa, right in the Black Hills. You know, we was able to acquire like 70 acres on the north side of Rapid City, kind of where the city is growing into. And there's a huge challenge there with Indigenous education. There's a need for a community center there. There's a need for Indigenous housing there. And that 70 acres, we have been able to begin to um, collaborate with different members of the community. And now there's a school there. There's actually a school there called the Osheti Shakoe Community Academy that is a community-based model of Indigenous education that is teaching Lakota children Lakota culture education and also trying to increase educational outcomes in the community. And they actually, we are able to they have a piece of land and they have a building and a facility, and hopefully they can keep growing that over time. There's also something called Gesapa OTP, which is a nonprofit that is building an Indian center there. And recently, the city of Rapid City allocated $9 million, I made a commitment of $9 million of vision funds to go for the building of that. Well, without that organization having access to land, they would have never got that commitment. And the result of that project, over the next, probably 24 to 36 months, is there's going to be a community center built on that land, there in the Gesapa for the community. And that's something elders have been, requesting since like the early 1950s to be there in the community. So those are examples of like what happens when we get land back. There's also like, examples in Alaska with the EAC Community Land Trust that we helped stand up. And they have gotten land back on EAC Lake and Sea Otter Island that they're turning into convening spaces and cultural spaces for the EAC people. There's the list kind of goes on and on. There's a lot of really powerful examples of what it's looked like. Those are just some of the ones that we have
Right.
been really involved with.
What are the main challenges to your work? I imagine it'll be different based on what you encounter, but in broad brush strokes, I mean, 2016 was also the year that Donald Trump first took power in the United States. And that era, although there was a brief 4 years of not having Trump in power, he's back, and it's been far too long. Does his rule represent one of the main obstacles, or is it smaller than that, more specific than that?
It's both. I mean, I think that indigenous people, like the reality is that we have dealt with erasure and oppression and disenfranchisement under multiple regimes. And throughout history. And so like one of the issues that we have dealt with consistently is that there's perpetual racism towards indigenous people and it's institutional. And a lot of it is because there's been active efforts to erase indigenous people from history in the United States. And and it makes it really hard for our work to be seen. It makes it really hard for our work to be visible. It makes it hard for our work. So I always say, like in Indigenous organizing, it feels like we often have to be the loudest person in the room just for the pure opportunity to even have the chance that our work is seen and that our people are seen and our struggle is realized. And so I think that that is a constant thing. I think the other thing too is that if you look at the creation of America, most of the structures that are in place are directly responsible for the stealing of Indigenous people's land and the extraction of the resources from Indigenous people's land, and that those systems continue to be in existence today. So the legal system, the land management system, the Bureau of Land Management, the structures that have been put in place were put in place to not only steal the land from Indigenous people, but to maintain the continued theft of the land and the extraction of the resources to this day. And so us as organizers in trying to create solutions, we're dealing with an archaic system that is not fair from the get-go. In fact, its intention was to do exactly what it was doing. And so when we think about land back is a decolonial framework to dismantle those systems of that continue to oppress our people and to destroy the environment. And dismantling systems that have been heavily funded and supported by the United States government has been, a huge challenge. And when you think about the political climate that we find ourselves in, I do think that one of the biggest threats to tribal sovereignty and to land back is the rise of authoritarianism, because they don't they don't want other sovereigns operating within their territories. And so, yet this entire country, the United States, was made up of sovereigns within it. And when the United States entered into nation-to-nation relationships with indigenous people. And so, as we see the rise of authoritarianism beginning to rise, it is a threat to land back, to tribal sovereignty, and to many of the human rights work that Indian Collective and the land back movement really, really does work on. And so we have layers and layers of complexity and challenges as it exists there.
I know that one of the central goals, at least from looking at Indians Collective's website, is storytelling and narrative. And what you were just talking about alludes a little bit to that, because you might encounter a lot of Americans who don't see this land, especially, this is the 250th anniversary of the formation of this country called the United States of America, and the celebrations are very likely going to include a lot of erasure of actual history and erasure of Indigenous culture. How does storytelling and narrative building figure into Indian Collective's work?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the exciting things is we actually just launched a new website called landback.org. Landback.org is a storytelling platform to tell stories of the land back movement. On there, it's also home to a podcast that we have called Land Back for the People, where we use and create our own media and our own platform to tell the stories of what's happening in the land back movement on the ground from the real people who are doing those work. It's a microphone, right? It's a microphone that we use. The website is able to use to create short form videos. It's used to be able to create blogs for people to write, to update and tell their stories of what they're working on. And these are so important, right? Like really, really important mechanisms that we tell our own story, because I think that in order to push back against the erasure, that telling authentic stories. And I think that the American public is hungry for authentic stories. I think that there's always so many stories that are being told where there's constantly lies in the media. And I think human beings can begin to see through those lies, especially when they're just told stories that are authentic of people on the ground doing those work and doing that work of fighting for their rights and fighting for their freedom and fighting for their land. And I think people resonate with that, because now I always say what's happening in the United States is everybody is beginning to be treated like Indigenous people have always been treated in this country, and people are getting pissed about it. And quite frankly, that's a good thing in the sense that people are getting pissed about it, because then it gives us the ability to organize with one another and to build one another and build new stories. So I think storytelling is really, really important, and those are some of the mechanisms in the way in which we do it. And I also will say this, that in the political moment that we find ourselves in, it's really not about the organizations, it's about the people. The movements are made up of human beings and people, and organizations are merely tools. And the rise of authoritarianism thinks that, oh, but we would take down all these organizations. Well, by taking down the organizations, you're not going to destroy the movement, right? People are going to continue to organize through that, through those things and through those challenges, as we have throughout history. And we're always going to tell our stories, and we're going to find ways to tell our stories in authentic ways that resonate with other human beings, everywhere.
Do you worry that there are still too many people who have bought into the notion of sovereignty for white people only, and who see that storytelling that you're doing as a threat to them, right? Who have bought into this idea that this is a country for white Christian people?
I think that they're the minority, though. I think that there is like a majority that continues to grow, and I think that when we think about authoritarianism, it's really a class war, and it's less about religion, it's less about race. We're seeing a class war
That's
happening
a
in
really good point. Say
and
more.
and it's like, like poor white Christians in the South are are being treated like right now. Like their food stamps are being cut, right? The things that they benefit are being cut. Like the attacks on free speech are an attack on them. They're attacking all of us. And so when I think about what's happening in the world a little bit, there's actually more on-ramps for us to work through our differences than it is to for us to focus on what separates us. Because right now, the rich of the rich are only looking out for themselves. They don't care what somebody's race is. They don't care what somebody's color of their skin is or what their religion is or anything. In fact, they're creating strategies to come after people's freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all of the rights that people have. And authoritarianism wants to control those things. Authoritarianism wants to think that the commander in chief can tell military leaders exactly what to do without military leaders resisting in any which way, shape, or form. When the fact is that military leaders in this country have an obligation to the Constitution of the United States. What happens when your commander in chief has no regard for the Constitution of the United States? People have a decision that they have to make. And I think that when this is what I think about when I think about a class war, when I think about very, very small group of people, the president and quote unquote his friends are in his people that are in his class that get to make the decisions that impact 99% of the rest of the people in this country. And that's why I think that it's really important for us to think about um, this country and think about the future in an inclusive way. Like it's our opportunity to build a country that actually does work for all people and work for the earth. But we have to be imaginative in this moment. We have to both resist the onslaught of the rise of authoritarianism, and we have to be able to realize that we get to innovate and create a new reality in the future at the same time.
Nick, who do you see as your natural allies in the broader social justice movement? I imagine that, of course, other Indigenous organizations you must be collaborating with, but even beyond that, where does Indian Collective fit within the universe of social justice organizations? Say, organizations that might be working against racism against Black people or for immigrant rights. I mean, is it part of this bigger movement that you can see? And of course, climate justice, I imagine, is central too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's organizations like, the Movement for Black Lives, organizations like Mi Gente, organizations that are cross movement that we work with. We work with tons of Indigenous people in different territories that are much smaller organizations. But then we work across movement. I think that there's a lot of solidarity that I see building between Black and Indigenous solidarity. And I think that because historically, this entire country, like was built on stolen lands with stolen hands. And that historically they have tried to pit our communities against each other as sort of a battle for the bottom. uh, and also like this effort to try to erase what this country has done, both to our Black brothers and sisters and to Indigenous people. So I see a lot of solidarity building between Black and Indigenous folks. I've been in more and more spaces where Black and Indigenous folks are collaborating together collectively to see how we build shared strategies so that we can continue to speak truth to power and organize new solutions that directly impact each and every one of our communities. And I think that I see learning happening in those movements. NDN Collective has been very focused on indigenous self-determination, but it has always been part of our theory of liberation that when indigenous self-determination is invested into and people are valued, it allows us to show up in ways of deep and meaningful solidarity with other movements. And now we're beginning to actually start to see that more and more. I think that in the future, you'll see way more collaborations between the Black liberation movement and the Indigenous peoples movement, because we see that the things that are coming down on our people are the same things, the same systems.
Well, Nick, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Good luck to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. Keep up the good work. It's a crazy world out there.
It
And
certainly is.
I'm glad that we have folks like you organizing and sharing stories.
Thank you. Likewise. My guest has been Nick Tilsen, the founder and CEO of NDN Collective and a citizen of the Oglala Lakota Nation. And this is Rising Up for Justice. I'm SonaliKolhatkar, host and executive producer of this half-hour series, exclusive to viewers of Free Speech TV and subscribers of my long-standing program, Rising Up with Sonali. You can find out more at risingupwithsonali.com.